All right, today we're going to talk about how electing a president works. All right, be forewarned though, it's a long and difficult process. So there's only 4 steps, which you guys are going to write down. But these steps are a little bit complicated, especially the more towards the end you get. So, step 1, the 2 major parties in each state vote for who they want their party's nominee to be. Then, step 2, party leadership selects the nominee at the national convention in the summer before the general election. Step 3, in the general election, people around the country vote. And then in step 4, the Electoral College decides the winner of the general election. So we, by the way, as of when I'm recording this on Monday, November 2nd, the day before Election Day, we are right here. So we are in the midst of the general election. We are coming to the end, and then we'll see what happens from there. And just as a heads up, as we go through each of these steps, I'm going to explain how they relate to the 2020 presidential election so you can relate them to the real world. All right, so here's a nice image. You can pause and check this out. Just explains the path to becoming president. So first of all, in order to even run for president, there's certain requirements you must meet. You must be a natural-born citizen, you must be at least 35 years old, and you must have been a U.S. resident for at least 14 years. So again, this just illustrates what I just talked about, and we'll go through each of these steps in detail. First step is primaries and caucuses, in which the major parties pick their nominees. Then there's the national convention, in which each major party finalizes their nominees. Then the general election, in which the nominees from the major parties face off against one another. And then step 4, the Electoral College, which is a massively confusing system that we will go through in detail together. All right, step 1, primaries and caucuses. So what you're going to write down is in yellow in your handout. So step 1, parties select their candidates through primaries and caucuses, right? So the way it works is the Republicans select their nominee, the Democrats select their nominee. Those are the 2 major parties, right? There are third parties, but they don't get as much press. So this step occurs in the winter/spring of the election year, sometimes even a little bit earlier. So the major political parties in each state choose their nominee. So this occurs at the state level. And the nominee is the person they want to represent their party in the general election. So who are the Democrats going to run as their presidential candidate? Who are the Republicans going to run as their presidential candidate? And again, this occurs at the state level. So states can do this through one of 2 methods. They can hold either primaries or they can hold caucuses. Now, primaries are just pretty straightforward elections, right? So that's the way that California does it. So in the primary elections in California, you get a ballot. It lists the name of the potential candidates for your party. So if you're a Democrat, who do you want to be the Democratic nominee? If you're a Republican, who do you want to be the Republican nominee? So it's just a straightforward vote with a ballot. Caucuses, on the other hand, are a little bit more complicated. So these are essentially informal meetings. A bunch of people will get together or in a gym or in a church or in a school. And essentially what they'll do is people will stand in groups and they'll basically say, hey, if you support so-and-so, come and stand with me. And the goal is to get the biggest group possible. That's a huge oversimplification of how caucuses work. Just suffice it to say, caucuses are a little bit strange. Not that many states hold them. Most states tend to hold primaries. Now, states can choose when they hold their primaries or caucuses. So the states like to hold them earlier as it gives them more power in the selection process, as candidates can get a boost from an early win. So for example, the first contest most years is the Iowa caucus. So Iowa chooses that strange method where they all stand in a room and yell at each other. And if a candidate wins the Iowa caucus, that can give them a huge boost in terms of popularity. Does that mean they will for sure win the nomination? No, it doesn't. But having some forward momentum at the beginning of a contest really helps you out. All right, so how does this apply to the 2020 election? Well, on the Republican side, Trump had very few primary challengers, and most of these challengers, they were pretty much symbolic. So this is pretty typical when we have an incumbent running for re-election. So an incumbent is a person who already holds office, right? So Trump pretty handily won his nomination. Now, the Democratic primaries and caucuses were much more contentious. There were a lot of Democratic candidates, and there was a lot of debate over whether the party should choose a more left-leaning candidate, like Bernie Sanders, who identifies as a socialist, or a more moderate candidate, like Joe Biden. And there was also a lot of debate over whether they should choose an older candidate or a younger candidate. There was a huge mess with the Iowa caucuses because there were some tech glitches that made it unclear who the winner was. So suffice to say, it was a very, very contentious primary season for the Democrats. All right, step 2 is the National Convention. So after all that campaigning in the primaries, this occurs the summer of an election year. So each of the two major political parties, so the Republicans and the Democrats, hold these big meetings called national conventions. And at these meetings, they formally pick the candidate which they're going to field in the general election, right? So who are the Democrats going to run as their candidate? Who are the Republicans going to run as their candidate? And these two candidates will face off against one another. Now, typically by this point, because most states all the states have had their primaries and caucuses, we know who's going to be the nominee going into the convention. So really the convention is just kind of a formality. The party is just rubber stamping, yes, we want this person to be our nominee, blah, 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 right? Also, though, other important things do happen at this convention as well. Typically, the candidate will choose their vice presidential nominee, so who is going to be their running mate. And the party also formalizes their party platform, which is a statement of the party's beliefs on certain policy issues. All right, so let's talk about how that applies to 2020. So Donald Trump, as you probably know, in 2016 chose Mike Pence as his running mate. Mike Pence is currently the vice president. So Trump chose not to switch out his vice presidential nominee. He stuck with Mike Pence. And just as a little interesting side note, the Republicans actually did not do a new party platform this year. They just stuck with the same one from 2016. On the Democratic side, Joe Biden became the nominee, as you are no doubt aware, given the signs that you are seeing outside as you go drive around Roseville and whatnot. So Joe Biden formally accepted the Democratic nomination for president and picked Kamala Harris as his vice presidential candidate. And just as an interesting little side note, in those Democratic primaries, Kamala Harris was actually one of Joe Biden's primary challengers. So that also highlights how one of the purposes of the convention is to kind of bring everyone in the party together. So even if they were challenging each other before, now they're all friends and everyone has made up and is on the same page now. All right, step 3, here is where we're at right now as of recording this, and this is the general election. So now that each party has picked their nominee, those nominees face off against one another. So this happens in the fall of an election year, so after the party's conventions, and then election day itself is the first Tuesday in November. So you have been seeing a general election campaign live, right? So you've been seeing candidates campaigning against one another, running ads on TV and other places, having rallies and participating in debates with one another. On election day or before, if you vote by mail or have early voting, or participate in early voting, voters choose electors who will vote for their candidate in the Electoral College. So wait a minute, what? So when I go to vote in November and I check the box next to my favorite candidate's name, I'm not actually voting for that candidate? Correct, you are not voting for that candidate. You are voting for an elector in the Electoral College, sort of. So what that elector is doing is saying that when they go to the Electoral College, they will vote for your candidate, right? And they can flip their vote, by the way. So how does that work? Okay, this is massively confusing. So let's talk about the Electoral College. All right. So step 4, the Electoral College meets to formally decide who wins the presidential election. And this happens in December, so the winner of an election year. So here's how it works. So candidates don't win individual votes, they win states, right? So if you're watching the election returns come in on November 3rd at night, you'll see, oh, so-and-so has won California, so-and-so has won Florida, oh no, Pennsylvania is in debate, who's going to win Pennsylvania? So candidates are winning states, they're not winning individual votes. So how does that work? So each state has as many electors or as many electoral votes as it has members in Congress. So representatives plus senators for a minimum of 3. So if you're a small state that only has 1 representative, you get that vote plus your 2 senators. for a total of 3 electoral votes. If you're a larger state like California, you obviously have more representatives plus the 2 votes for representing the 2 senators, right? But it's not just states. Washington, D.C. also has some electoral votes, so they have 3 electoral votes. This leads to a total of 538 electoral votes up for grabs, and candidates need 270 of these votes to win. So if the candidate wins the majority of the popular vote in a state, so if more than 50% of voters cast their ballots for a candidate, that candidate then wins all of the state's electors. So this is called the winner-take-all system. So if a candidate wins 50% of the vote in a particular state, so say Trump wins 51% of the vote in Florida, then he gets all of Florida's electoral votes, and those get added towards his total. So that's how that works. So on election night, probably not this year, because of the coronavirus pandemic making things complicated, on a typical year, we typically know who has reached that 270 elector threshold on or near election night. So it's not like we have to wait until December when the Electoral College formally meets to figure out who has actually won the election. But officially, nothing is really set in stone until the electors actually meet and vote in December. All right. Now we're going to do a little bit more discussion on the Electoral College. You guys are going to watch a video, but the Electoral College is pretty contentious, especially this year. So there are definitely some advantages and disadvantages to it, and you guys are going to get a chance to share your thoughts on whether you think the Electoral College is a fair and effective method of picking the president. So the pros of the Electoral College is that the Electoral College actually gives a boost to rural, less populous states. And it was actually designed that way. That's the entire point of the Electoral College. That's actually one of the reasons why we don't elect the president by popular vote. So whoever wins the largest raw total of votes wins. That's why we don't have that system, is because the framers wanted to give a boost to rural, less populous states, especially states in the South. Now, problems with that, right? Well, what this means is that, or what the Electoral College means, is that candidates can win the electoral vote without winning the popular vote. And this has happened several times, most recently in the 2016 presidential election. So in the 2016 presidential election, Hillary Clinton won 48% of the popular vote. So 48% of voters voted for her, whereas Trump won 46% of the popular vote. So 46% of voters voted for him. However, Trump won 304 electoral votes based on the states that he won, in comparison to Clinton's 227 votes. So that made Trump the winner. So some folks look at this system and they say, hey, that doesn't seem very fair. That doesn't seem very democratic. If more people vote for a candidate, shouldn't that candidate win? What truly reflects the will of the people?